Hello, YouTube. Sidekick here in my trusty A10A, the OG Hawg. Here with the first in a series of videos about the Cold War, or specifically about reenacting the Cold War in DCS. And by that I mean simulating an invasion of the Federal Republic of Germany by Warsaw Pact forces in, say, the early 1980s. Because this was, in some ways, the point of maximum danger because of Warsaw Pact superiority in conventional forces at that time, which we'll get into in a bit. But I guess we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves. So let's just stop for a sec and go back and do a little bit of a history lesson. Before I do that, do let me apologize for the quality of my voice. I've had a bit of a head cold for a while, and it's refusing to go away. So I'm afraid this is the only way you're going to get to listen to me, at least for a while. At any rate, let's talk about the Cold War. In the early 1980s, it was really the height of the Cold War, which pitted the West, consisting mostly of liberal democracies headed by the United States, against the communist bloc headed by the Soviet Union. Now, although there were many theaters in the Cold War, and actually many small hot wars involving proxies on both sides, the principal point of contact between the two sides was, of course, Northwest Europe, specifically the Federal Republic of Germany, also known as West Germany. Now, the confrontation involved the two main military alliances, NATO in the West and the Warsaw Pact in the East. Now, NATO emerged from the ashes of World War II, conceived in 1949 as the Western bulwark against the specter of Soviet expansionism. The alliance was really more than a military pact. It was also kind of a declaration of shared democratic values and a collective commitment to mutual defense. It initially comprised 12 nations from both sides of the Atlantic. Now, in the 1950s and 60s, NATO's cohesion was tested with the Korean War, the construction of the Berlin Wall, and France's actual withdrawal from the military command structure, but not the alliance. And it kind of underscored, the complex dynamics of Cold War politics. And we don't really have time to go into that today, but I think it's fair to say that those challenges did, though, kind of solidify NATO's purpose and make it clear why it was necessary. The era of what was called détente in the 1970s saw NATO, navigate through a phase of relative East-West relationship thawing, with strategic arms negotiations that culminated in something called the Helsinki Accords, which was a significant diplomatic achievement. Now, by the early 1980s, though, with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan renewing global tensions, NATO found itself kind of at a pivotal juncture. It was balancing the imperatives of deterrence with the pursuit of diplomatic engagement, but it was also facing a rapidly modernizing Soviet and Warsaw Pact military, which was kind of eroding NATO's quality advantage, which had always been NATO's answer to the Warsaw Pact's massive numerical superiority. Now, the Warsaw Pact, officially known as the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance, was established in 1955 as a collective defense treaty among 8 communist states of Central and Eastern Europe in response to NATO. It was, of course, led by the Soviet Union, and it did originally include Albania, which did withdraw in 1968, though. It also included Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and, of course, Russia itself. Throughout its existence, the Warsaw Pact was really the central mechanism by which the Soviet Union was able to maintain control over its Eastern European allies. It served both as a military alliance against the West and really an instrument of Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe. The pact facilitated the stationing of Soviet troops in member states and coordinated military strategies and policies. In the early years of the Cold War, it demonstrated its real purpose in incidents like the suppression of the 1956 Hungarian uprising and the 1968 Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia, where effectively the Soviet Union and other pact members invaded to quash reforms and maintain the status quo. Now, these interventions starkly demonstrated the pact's role in enforcing Soviet orthodoxy over its satellite states' domestic policies. So, despite the name suggesting mutual cooperation, the Warsaw Pact also kind of underscored the asymmetry between the Soviet Union and its allies. with the USSR using the alliance to keep its neighbors in line and counter Western influence during the Cold War. By 1982, the cracks were beginning to show within the alliance due to differing national interests and the beginning of political and economic stagnation in the Soviet Union. This, combined with the increasing embarrassment of Soviet occupation of Afghanistan and the decreasing qualitative deficit against NATO forces, meant, the time was about as ripe as it had ever been for the Warsaw Pact to test NATO's resolve in a conventional confrontation. Now, in 1982, the combined strengths of the Warsaw Pact militaries exceeded 5.5 million, of which over 3 million were in the ground forces. In all, NATO was facing about 230 divisions, more than half of which were Soviet, and over 75% of which were rated as Category A, meaning essentially ready for combat. They included about 60,000 tanks, of which 20,000 were frontline main battle tanks facing NATO in East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, and in Czechoslovakia, the CSSR, and in Poland. Overall, the Warsaw Pact enjoyed a manpower advantage of, at least 1.5 to 1, but more like a 4 to 1 advantage in armor and artillery. More to the point, the Warsaw Pact forces were concentrated within easy reach of the border, while NATO had the bulk of its personnel stationed in the continental United States that would need to be moved to Europe to marry up with their equipment in the advent of hostilities. Worse, in the 20 years since 1960, the United States and NATO had seen its advantage in both weapon systems and combat power constantly eroded because the Warsaw Pact had not only grown its numerical advantage, but by 1980 it was rapidly modernizing and eroding the qualitative advantage, kind of on which NATO had relied to even the score. Now, NATO, particularly the United States, was responding to this challenge by developing weapons like the M1 Abrams, the M2 Bradley, and the Germans were developing the new Leopard 2 main battle tank. Now, these would reestablish NATO technical dominance of the battlefield, but in the early 1980s, they hadn't really reached the front line in any numbers yet. In short, it was a time when the Warsaw Pact enjoyed probably the clearest advantage that it ever would over NATO in terms of conventional forces. So let's assume that for whatever set of reasons, perhaps involving tensions elsewhere in the global Cold War, or because of diplomatic missteps or miscalibration by the more hawkish elements of either NATO or the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet leadership reached the conclusion that armed conflict with the West is inevitable. Now, if you want a more fully drawn scenario for such a decision, you could always take a look at Red Storm Rising by Tom Clancy that paints, what seems like an improbable but still credible set of circumstances that would lead to war. At any rate, let's assume that the balloon really did go up, and let's say in the summer of 1982. What would that have looked like on the ground? And more to the point, what part of that could we realistically simulate, or at least reenact, in DCS? So let's first take a look at how the Warsaw Pact intended to operate. And by Warsaw Pact here, I principally mean Soviet, since it would have been Soviet divisions in the lead of any invasion. Now, Soviet doctrine emphasized shock, momentum, and mass. It was designed to overwhelm defenders with constant pressure, provided by incessant forward movement of multiple echelons, accepting attrition of the leading echelons in order to wear down the defense to eventually break through and exploit. Warsaw Pact forces were organized into armies, which were kind of about the same size as NATO Corps. These armies normally consisted of several divisions. There were two types of divisions, the tank division and the motor rifle division. Now, both of these were actually combined arms formations. The tank divisions were about 2/3 armored, and the motor rifle divisions were about 2/3 mechanized infantry. Each division was built according to a standard template. Now, the principal maneuver unit in each of the divisions was the regiment, either a tank regiment or a motor rifle regiment. Now, as with the divisions, each regiment also conformed to a common structure. The commonality across units and formations at the time allows Soviet doctrine to be an enforced standard and to use rigid templates of movement and deployment, especially in the advance to contact in the initial phases of the assault. So it can be expected that the enemy invasion is going to conform to these templates. So let's use a motor rifle regiment as a template. Now, the motor rifle regiment consists of 4 maneuver battalions, 3 motor rifle battalions, and 1 tank battalion, as well as organic artillery, air defense, and anti-tank guided missile resources. In practice, though, the motor rifle regiment would normally enter combat as a kind of triangular organization because it would split the tank battalion up amongst the motor rifle battalions, and so it would basically have 3 reinforced motor rifle battalions as its maneuver units. Each reinforced motor rifle battalion would consist of 3 motor rifle companies and a tank company. Each maneuver company would consist of 3 platoons of 4 vehicles each, along with a small company command element. Each motor rifle battalion, in addition to including those motor rifle and tank companies, would include a mortar battery for indirect fire support and also some organic air defense and anti-tank guided missile detachments. Now, since Soviet doctrine emphasized rapid advance, units are expected to adopt and remain in route of march formation until literally being forced to deploy by enemy resistance. Thus, route march formations at each level consist of recon parties that are thrown out in front to identify and picket enemy positions, followed by a forward security element, which is designed to basically defeat or force the withdrawal of delaying forces, or in the event that that can happen, it's supposed to engage and fix those forces so that the follow-on elements can attack them. The forward security element, which is basically company-sized, is followed by the lead echelon called the advance guard, which is basically a battalion from which that company has been drawn. The advance guard is followed by a command group, and that command also includes fire support assets, if, for instance, those assets haven't been already placed forward with the forward security element, which they could have been. The command group is followed by the follow-on echelons. Both the command group and the follow-on echelons are sufficiently far behind the advance guard so that they won't have to slow down or deploy if the advance guard encounters opposition that it can overcome, even to the extent of requiring it to do a hasty assault. So you basically have 1 battalion in the lead with 1 detached company push forward, then you have the regimental headquarters, and then you have 2 more battalions. It's expected that if that forward security element company encounters an enemy force that can't be dislodged, it will fix the enemy position while the advance guard, which is about 5 kilometers behind, starts deploying from line of march into a pre-battle formation. It won't deploy actually into full battle formation until it's only a couple of kilometers from the enemy. Simultaneously, supporting artillery units will deploy from line of march into firing position when the advance guard starts moving forward into pre-battle. Follow-on echelons, though, will remain in route march formation and ready to drive through the enemy positions once the lead echelon's hasty assault has broken into it, because those follow-on echelons are probably somewhere between 10 and 25 kilometers behind the advance guard, so they can keep rolling forward while the advance guard is actually assaulting a position. In the event that the advance guard has actually encountered the main line of resistance and it can't break through, then it will halt, and once again it'll fix the enemy positions while the remainder of the lead regiment moves forward, deploys into pre-battle formation, and pause. It may pause also while the regimental artillery group deploys. Divisional and higher artillery may at this point start moving forward to deploy and add fire support. But this process of constant pressure and rapid escalation will continue. The minimum amount of delay will be tolerated between encountering enemy resistance and attacking it. And those follow-on regiments and divisions will be added into the battle as soon as they arrive. And at every stage, the emphasis will be placed on rapid deployment into assault formations with rapidly escalating levels of indirect fire to saturate enemy defenses and prevent rest, reinforcement, or reorganization. So, since we're talking about DCS, what's the role of air power in this scenario? NATO expected that the one place that it would enjoy a decisive advantage in both quality and quantity was the air. Thus, NATO's doctrine lent heavily on achieving and maintaining air superiority and then using it to counter the Warsaw Pact numerical advantage on the ground. So, the NATO air effort was expected to be kind of multi-layered. At the strategic level, air superiority fighters like the F-15, maybe the F-16, and even the F-4 would engage in offensive and defensive counter-air missions. Theater, front, army, and divisional level high-altitude SAMs would be sought out and suppressed or destroyed by dedicated Wild Weasels flying F-4Gs with the support of dedicated ECM aircraft in the form of EF-111s. Eventually, these would also be augmented by F-117 stealth fighters that could penetrate the SAM envelope to remove command and control nodes and other sort of critical infrastructure. With air superiority thus established, and with blanket coverage of air-to-air tankers and AWACS, the air forces would go to work taking on the Warsaw Pact ground forces. Now, tasking in this arena would include, first of all, deep interdiction missions to take out critical transportation, command and control nodes, and things like strategic resupply sources. Now, these kind of strikes would be controlled at the corps or theater level on the NATO side, and would take place well behind the front line, probably 50 kilometers or more in depth. This would have been the role of fast jets like the F-111, the F-4, possibly the A-7 and the F-16, as well as other NATO aircraft like the Tornado and maybe even the aging F-104. True tactical air power, managed at the division level and below, would operate in front of the forward edge of battle area, FIBA, to depths of maybe, 25 kilometers, maybe a bit more. Fixed-wing tactical air would focus mostly on battlefield interdiction, which basically means isolating the forward enemy elements from their follow-on support. So basically attacking those follow-on depth echelons of ground troops with the aim of actually making them deploy or stop and reorganize, and to prevent reinforcements, such as artillery units, from moving into position to support the forward echelons as they started the assault. Now, this would have been the Hawg's barnyard. The A-10 was developed specifically to operate in this low-altitude, high-threat, target-rich environment. It was designed to loiter around the battlefield, flying slow enough to spot enemy concentrations, and with sufficient ordnance load to be able to generate massive kill ratios in terms of vehicles destroyed or damaged. So ground forces hope to have enough organic fire support in the form of direct and indirect fire weapons, meaning tanks and artillery, and air support in the form of attack helicopters, that they wouldn't require a lot of fixed-wing close air support of troops in contact, at least not in the initial phases of the battle. Now, if the odds started to shift, the fast air would be called in, but that was going to require significant coordination by ground forces in a pretty confusing and dynamic environment. The chances of friendly fire incidents would be high, and so, calling in the fast air for close air support was mostly going to be reserved for last-ditch defenses or for sealing off enemy penetrations to prevent a full breakout to the rear. Okay, so where does that leave us in DCS? With the current aircraft mix in DCS, there are really only a few scenarios in this overall scenario that we can reenact. We have the aircraft to simulate counter-air missions if we use the F-15C, or maybe we could even use the F-16 if we restrict the armament to what would have been present in the 1980s. Unfortunately, we really don't have the aircraft of the year to perform the suppression of any air defense and ECM missions. The only semi-dedicated seed aircraft in DCS right now is the F-16, but that's in a configuration from the late 1990s, really, the latest, or at the earliest, and no other DCS aircraft has EW capabilities at all. and none can carry the required missiles, which would have been HARMs, not the Shrikes that are available right now. I mean, even the F-4E won't really fill this hole because it won't be the F-4G version. So truly, Cold War SEAD is probably not a mission we're going to be able to simulate in DCS anytime soon. Now, the F-4E will give the capacity to simulate deep strike and interdiction missions, so we will have some options there when it releases, you know, depending on the weapon and sensor loadouts that we get and how functional they end up being. But for now, there is, again, no strike aircraft from that era available in DCS. The F-15E now fills that role, but again, it's a child of the 90s, not the 80s. So really, the only mission that's left to us that we can actually do in DCS is battlefield interdiction and close air support, which was the domain of the A-10A, which thankfully we do have in DCS. To be fair, we also have the F-5, which was Canada's choice to fill this role, and if you enjoy inflicting as much pain on yourself as on the enemy, you're welcome to try that aircraft in this role. But, you know what? The environment really is the puddle in which the Hawg was meant to wallow. I mean, if we want to spend disbelief a little bit, we can even use the C model in this role, so long as we resist the temptation to use the modern avionics to their full capacity, and we restrict the armament to unguided weapons, supplemented by a few early model Mavericks money, maybe. You know, and for my money, we really do want to give this a try. So, in the next video in this series, I'm going to talk more about how to simulate a Warsaw Pact invasion on the ground, and to begin to look at why that presents a challenge that the A-10 is, you know, particularly tailor-made to meet, and why it's also maybe a situation that we don't often see when we play in DCS. So stay tuned for the next installment of this series. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you again soon. This is going to be Sidekick, signing off.